What if I told you that on the same night, in the same city, sleep could be the ultimate pleasure and the most sophisticated torture? While some were sinking into down comforters behind velvet curtains, others were paying their last pennies just to hang themselves. The Victorian era created a chasm between people that could not be bridged, even in sleep. It was not just a difference in comfort, but two completely different worlds, separated by just a few streets in cold London. Behind the closed doors of mansions and in the damp basements of night shelters, stories unfolded that are not usually written about in textbooks. We are used to seeing beautiful balls and elegant dresses, but real life began when the candles went out. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how an ordinary rope replaced beds for thousands of people and why the rich feared fresh air more than robbers. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the cheapest lodging in history looked like? In reality, it was so primitive that even the word lodging sounds too generous. The most shocking way for a poor person to spend the night was at a penny hang, known in the poor neighborhoods of Victorian London. It offered guests no privacy, no comfort, and no basic conditions for rest. There were no beds or couches, only long wooden benches for furniture. For a mere penny, a person could only get the opportunity to spend the night in warmth. The most shocking and cheapest way for a poor person to survive the night was the so-called penny hang. It appeared as a response to the growing flow of beggars who slept on the streets. The authorities and philanthropists tried to come up with the cheapest possible solution that would protect people from the deadly cold. This is how the idea of providing a room without beds but with minimal support for the body came about. This approach quickly spread throughout poor neighborhoods. Its simplicity was its main advantage. This place offered no beds, no mattresses, not even a level floor. People sat on a long bench, huddling close together. A thick, very strong rope was stretched in front of them, which they could lean on with their chest or arms. It replaced the back of a chair and partially supported the body. This method seemed strange, but it allowed people to get at least a little sleep. It saved the lives of those who had no other choice. For 1 penny, a person could enter a warm room and take a seat on the bench. Inside, there was usually a stove or a small furnace that maintained a minimum level of heat. This saved people from freezing, which was common on the streets of London in winter. For many, this service was their only chance to stay alive. People could at least warm their hands and rest a little. The safety of the room was considered its main advantage. A rope was stretched in front of those sitting down, on which they could lean with all their weight. It was a strange but necessary support for bodies exhausted by a day's work. It was not easy to sleep sitting up, but the rope kept people from falling. It seems unthinkable, but for many this was the only way to avoid freezing on the street at night. Many had nowhere else to go. The workers' barracks were overcrowded, and charity shelters could not cope with the influx of people in need. The city was growing rapidly, and the number of poor people was increasing every month. Their fate depended on random earnings and the generosity of the street. Therefore, even this option was considered a salvation. People were willing to endure any discomfort for the sake of warmth. People sat on narrow wooden benches close to each other, leaning on a rope. Their shoulders touched, and at times it seemed that the whole group was moving as a single organism. The rope kept their bodies upright, preventing them from falling onto the dirty floor. Sleep in such a position was difficult and intermittent. Their bodies would stiffen after just a few minutes, but it was better than spending the night under the open sky. Their bodies ached, their legs went numb, and their backs hurt after just an hour on the bench. People woke up every minute, trying to change position, but space was limited. There was no support for the head or neck. Long sleep was impossible. They could only fall into a brief slumber. Time stretched on endlessly, but the room still provided an important sense of security. However, it was warmer inside than outside, and the roof protected them from the freezing rain. London weather often brought showers, sleet, and dampness. Outside, these conditions became deadly for the poor. At least inside the night shelter, there was no biting wind. Wet clothes slowly dried, and people recovered from a long day. This gave them the strength to continue fighting for survival. Dozens of men and women, exhausted from a day's labor, could line up along a single rope. They sat shoulder to shoulder, passing warmth to each other. The basement was filled with the thick smell of wet clothes and dirt. But no one complained because the alternative was even worse. The rope was a symbolic boundary between shelter and the street. It separated life from death. The rope served as a support, allowing people to at least temporarily remain in a sitting position. It dug into their chests, leaving deep marks on their skin. Sometimes the rope rubbed so hard that it left bleeding marks. But the guests accepted this as an inevitable part of the night. They understood that without it, they would simply fall to the floor. So they endured it in silence. In the morning, the famous awakening ritual took place, which became a legend of that time. The caretaker of the establishment simply cut the rope or untied it. In an instant, dozens of people lost their support. They fell forward or on top of each other, like dolls that had lost their strings. This method of waking guests was quick and rough, but for the owners, it was more important to free up the space. Sleepy people fell to the floor, trying to get up and regain their balance. Some got up, holding onto the walls or their neighbors. Noise, moans, and helpless laughter filled the room. This moment was humiliating, but it was perceived as part of the general reality. No one protested or argued. Those who had paid only a penny had no say in the matter. After such an awakening, people went out into the street broken, with numb limbs. Deep marks from the rough rope remained on their bodies. Some claimed that even such a sleep was better than a winter night on the sidewalk. The dampness and cold of the streets killed quickly and mercilessly. Therefore, even such a difficult experience seemed acceptable. People clung to any opportunity to survive. It was the minimum price for life in the cruel world of the Victorian city. The rope became a symbol of extreme poverty, beyond which there was nothing left. People who slept on the rope were at the bottom of the social ladder. Few people cared about their fate. However, every evening, these basements filled up again, because they had no other place to sleep. Today, it is difficult for us to imagine that a person could voluntarily sleep in such conditions. We are used to considering a bed a basic necessity, something natural and permanent. But the past shows that comfort is a privilege, not a right. The Victorian era reminded people how fragile human comfort is. Could you close your eyes in such a position for at least an hour? I am very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this way of spending the night? Guess how long it took to create this? We are talking about the bed of a wealthy Victorian, which was not just a piece of furniture, but a complex engineering structure. In aristocratic homes, the bedroom became a veritable fortress, designed to protect its owner from their main enemy, the cold. Central heating did not exist, and the huge rooms cooled down to freezing temperatures overnight. Therefore, a four-poster bed was a necessity, not just a luxury item. The massive wooden structure rose above the floor, creating an insulated space inside the room. Heavy velvet or brocade curtains were tightly drawn on all sides. This created the effect of a room within a room, where precious heat was retained. The fabric was so thick that it did not let in a single draft from outside. Inside such a cocoon, the temperature could be several degrees higher than in the rest of the bedroom. Preparing the bed for sleep was a whole ritual that the servants performed long before the arrival of the owners. The main tool was a copper hot water bottle with a long wooden handle. It was filled with hot coals from the fireplace and tightly closed with a lid. The maid methodically moved this hot water bottle between the sheets, ironing every centimeter of cold fabric. It was important not only to warm the bed, but also to remove the dampness that was a constant companion in English homes. If the hot water bottle was held in one place for too long, the expensive fabric could burn. Therefore, the movements had to be quick and even. Sometimes ceramic bottles filled with hot water and wrapped in flannel were used. They remained at the feet of the sleeper throughout the night, retaining the remaining heat. The bed itself consisted of many layers, each of which served its own purpose. At the bottom was a thick mattress stuffed with horsehair or straw for firmness. On top was a soft feather bed filled with the finest goose down. A person literally sank into this cloud, which enveloped the body on all sides. On top of the down feather bed, the thinnest linen sheets were spread, which were changed every day. Then there were several layers of woolen blankets of varying thickness and density. The structure was completed with a heavy quilted cover, often decorated with embroidery. The weight of all these layers was considerable, but it was precisely this that created a feeling of security. The height of the bed also had practical significance, separating the sleeper from the cold floor. Cold air, as we know, accumulates at the bottom, so the bed was raised as high as possible. A special ladder was often required to climb onto such a bed. This emphasized the status of the owner, who was elevated above the mundane and the cold. In such isolation, a rich person could sleep peacefully without feeling the icy breath of winter. The silence behind the thick curtains was absolute, cutting off any sounds from the large house. It was a world of peace, softness, and warmth, accessible only to the select few. The contrast with the street, where people froze to death, was striking. Even the chamber pot in such houses was often hidden in a special cabinet lined with sound-absorbing material. Comfort was thought out to the smallest detail so that nothing would disturb the master's sleep. The morning began only when the servant drew back the heavy curtains. But in the next chapter, you will learn how coffins became not only for the dead. Do you think it's comfortable to sleep with kilograms of heavy fabric hanging over you? I wonder how this topic is perceived in today's world of minimalism. What I'm about to show you is prohibited in 12 countries in today's world of fire safety, but back then it was considered a lifesaver. If you had 4 pennies, you could count on the luxury of the Salvation Army. This place was called 4-penny coffins and lived up to its name. The poor were offered to sleep in wooden boxes shaped like real coffins. These boxes stood in rows in a large hall, tightly pressed against each other. Inside each coffin was a thin mattress stuffed with straw and a piece of oilcloth. The oilcloth served as a blanket, although it did not keep you warm at all and was unpleasant to the touch. But under it, you could hide from the drafts and the gaze of your neighbors. A person would lie down in this wooden box and find themselves in their own small enclosed space. The high walls of the box created an illusion of privacy, which was so lacking on the street. Unlike the rope, here you could lie down horizontally and stretch your legs. For an exhausted poor person, this seemed like the height of comfort. However, the resemblance to a funeral home made a terrible impression on outside observers. Imagine a huge hall filled with hundreds of people lying in boxes. It seemed as if the living, tired of the struggle for existence, were being buried en masse here. The silence in such a hall was broken only by the coughing and heavy breathing of those asleep. Despite their gloomy appearance, these places were extremely popular and always crowded. 4 pence was the price of a loaf of bread, but people paid it for the opportunity to sleep. It was dry and relatively safe here, and no one cut the rope in the morning. The Salvation Army sincerely believed that it was helping people to preserve their human dignity. The oilcloth that people used to cover themselves was not chosen by chance, but for practical reasons. It was easy to wash and disinfect, which was important in unsanitary conditions. Fabric blankets quickly became a breeding ground for dirt, while oilcloth could simply be wiped down. Hygiene took precedence over comfort here. In winter, these halls were cold despite the meager heating. People slept in their outer clothing without taking off their coats and boots. The only reason it stayed warm was because hundreds of bodies were in one enclosed space. The air was stuffy and heavy, but it was warmer than outside. In the morning, Guests were offered a meager breakfast, a piece of bread and a mug of hot drink. This was included in the price of the night's stay and attracted even more people. For many, it was the only hot meal they had all day. The coffin provided not only sleep, but also hope for another day of life. This system of night shelters was an attempt to bring order to the chaos of London street life. It provided a minimum standard of survival, below which one should not fall. These wooden boxes saved thousands of lives by providing shelter on the coldest nights. The story of the 4-penny coffins is an example of how charity takes the strangest forms. In their desire to help, philanthropists created an image that today evokes horror. But for a person of the Victorian era, this box was a welcome island of tranquility. Like this story about strange charity if you found it impressive. Want to know a secret that will change your life, or at least your perception of mornings? For a wealthy Victorian, waking up was not just a matter of opening one's eyes, but a complex, multi-step process. No one jumped out of bed at the sound of an alarm clock to rush to work. The morning began slowly, smoothly, and required the participation of several servants. The first to enter the bedroom was a servant or maid, trying to make as little noise as possible. Their main task was to light a fire in the fireplace while the owners were still asleep. The room had cooled down overnight, and it was unthinkable to climb out from under a warm blanket into the cold air. The servant quietly fiddled with the coals and wood, creating the first warmth of the new day. Then the heavy curtains were opened, but not completely, only enough to let in the soft morning light. A sharp ray of sunlight was considered vulgar and harmful to the eyes after sleep. The light had to penetrate gradually, preparing the consciousness for awakening. Morning tea or chocolate was served in bed on a silver tray with the finest porcelain. Ladies and gentlemen drank hot beverages while sitting on pillows and reading their morning correspondence. This was a time to come to their senses and plan their day. No rush, no sudden movements. After tea, the long process of washing and dressing began. Servants brought hot water in large jugs, as there was no running water in the bedrooms. The water was poured into painted basins, and warm towels and soap were prepared. Everything had to be at the perfect temperature so as not to cause discomfort. Getting dressed was a separate, complicated procedure, especially for women with their corsets and multiple petticoats. Without the help of a maid, a lady simply could not get dressed on her own. A gentleman also needed the help of a valet to tie his tie or fasten complicated buttons. This took from 40 minutes to an hour. During this time, the servants tidied up the bed, fluffing the feather beds and changing the linens. The bedroom was aired out to get rid of the night air, which was considered heavy. Everything revolved around the comfort of one person. The morning toilet included thorough care of the hair, beard, or mustache. All kinds of oils, pomades, and rubs were used. Appearance was a calling card, and no time was spared in creating it. It was unthinkable to leave the bedroom looking unkempt. Such a morning set the tone for the whole day, measured, calm, and confident. The rich began their day with a sense of care and complete control over their time. They owned their morning, while the poor were slaves to the dawn. Do you agree with this? Please tell us what you think about such a complex morning ritual. In the next chapter, you will learn how the cold penetrated not only homes, but also bones. In the poor areas of London, the sleeping situation was completely different and frightening. Tenement houses were so overcrowded that the concept of personal space simply ceased to exist. Several families could live, eat, and sleep in one small room at the same time. People crammed into rooms like sardines in a barrel, trying to save money on rent. The hotbed system was often practiced where one sleeping place was rented out on a shift basis. A person leaving for work early in the morning would vacate the bed for someone who had just returned from the night shift. The bed never cooled down, retaining the smell and warmth of the previous occupant. It was hygienically terrible, but economically beneficial for the landlords. Such rooms were filled with stale, humid air, saturated with the smells of cooking, laundry, and human bodies. There was no ventilation, or it was extremely poor. Windows often did not open or were covered with rags for warmth. The walls were covered with black mold from the constant dampness dripping down the wallpaper. Children and adults slept huddled together on the floor with only old rags or straw for bedding. If there was a bed in the room, it was reserved for the most respected members of the family or those who paid more. The rest had to make do with corners, trying to stay close to the only source of heat, the hearth or stove. Constant noise was an integral part of the night in a tenement house. Thin walls did not hide the sounds of quarrels, crying, coughing, and the footsteps of neighbors. Sleep was restless, anxious, and constantly interrupted by external stimuli. People got used to sleeping in conditions of constant noise chaos. The lack of normal rest quickly affected the health and appearance of the residents. Their faces were gray, their eyes were inflamed, and their movements were sluggish and heavy. Chronic sleep deprivation became the norm for an entire class of people. They lived in a state of constant fatigue, not knowing what cheerfulness was. The unsanitary conditions in such overcrowded bedrooms reached appalling proportions. The lack of sewage and water supply forced people to use buckets, which were kept right there in the room. Taking out the waste in the morning was a difficult and unpleasant chore. The smell in the rooms was unbearable for anyone unaccustomed to it. The owners of tenement houses ruthlessly evicted those who could not pay for their lodging on time. People found themselves on the street with their meager belongings in all kinds of weather. The fear of losing this miserable corner was a constant companion in the life of the poor. A roof over one's head, even if it leaked, was the main value. Despite the cramped conditions, people tried to maintain at least some semblance of comfort. Women hung curtains to partition off corners and patched old blankets. Human nature demanded a home, even if that home was hell on earth. This crowding had one unexpected advantage. It was warmer in a crowd. People's bodies heated the air in the small room, preventing it from cooling down to the outside temperature. In harsh winters, it was precisely this crowding that saved many from freezing to death. What if I showed you a time machine through clothing? The night wardrobe of a Victorian gentleman or lady was no less well thought out than their daytime attire. It was not just clothing for sleeping, but real functional armor against the cold. Long nightshirts were made of thick flannel or cotton, reaching down to the ankles. The fabric had to be natural, soft, and warm. A nightcap for men and a bonnet for women were essential accessories. The head loses a lot of heat, and leaving it uncovered in a cold bedroom was reckless. Nightcaps often had a long end that could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf. This protected the throat from drafts and prevented colds. Women's nightgowns were decorated with lace and embroidery, but their main function remained utilitarian, to keep warm. A light night jacket was often worn over the nightgown if the room was particularly cool. Knitted wool socks were worn on the feet to keep them warm, even under the blanket. For the poor, the concepts of pajamas or nightgowns simply did not exist. They had only one set of clothes which they wore during the day, worked in, and slept in. Undressing for the night was impractical and cold. They only took off their shoes, and even then not always, for fear that they would be stolen. Sleeping in daytime clothes meant that the body never rested from rough fabric. If clothes got wet in the rain during the day, they dried right on the body at night. This led to constant colds, rheumatism, and skin diseases. Wet wool and cotton became an ice pack. The lack of a change of underwear meant that clothes were soaked with sweat and dirt around the clock. The smell ate into the fabric, becoming a second skin for the person. Washing was a rare and difficult event, requiring drying, which was problematic in a damp basement. Rich people changed their nightwear regularly, enjoying the feeling of freshness and cleanliness. They had different sets for winter and summer, made of different materials. This emphasized their status and ability to take care of their bodies even while sleeping. The difference in sleepwear was one of the most striking markers of social inequality. Some dressed in soft flannel, while others wrapped themselves in torn coats. For some, the night was a time of comfort. For others, a continuation of the daily struggle. There was even a difference in the choice of color for nightwear. The rich preferred white, which was easily stained but showed cleanliness. The poor wore dark and gray, on which dirt was less noticeable. It was practicality dictated by necessity. Do you sleep in pajamas or do you prefer an old t-shirt? In the next chapter, you will learn that silence also cost money and was not available to everyone. Silence in Victorian cities was as expensive a commodity as coal or silk. It did not arise on its own. It had to be bought, designed, and protected. Rich people understood that peace and quiet was a status symbol, so they sought to shield themselves from street noise. They chose the quietest locations for their homes, far from markets and factories. The urban environment became a mosaic, noisy industrial districts and islands of tranquility for the privileged. Silence was a luxury available to few. Wealthy neighborhoods were designed to minimize street noise, even at the architectural level. Houses stood deep in gardens, surrounded by thick greenery that muffled sounds. Paths were made winding so that noise would not pass directly through. Even the location of streetlights was taken into account so that they would not attract noisy passers-by. Such measures created an atmosphere of seclusion. It was as if the city had ceded the right to peace and quiet to these neighborhoods. Thick brick walls and double window frames served as a reliable barrier against the city noise. An airspace was left between the frames to block sound. The glass was of high quality and hardly rattled at all. Such windows were expensive, but they provided peace and quiet around the clock. Inside the house, there was a special coolness and silence. They made life noble and measured. Inside the mansions, silence was perceived as part of good manners. Thick carpets muffled footsteps and softened echoes. Heavy curtains hid the sounds of the street, creating a feeling of a soft, cozy world. Servants wore soft shoes, trying not to disturb their masters. Every little thing was under control. It was a silence created intentionally. The servants walked so quietly that their footsteps were almost inaudible. Even the doors were lubricated so they wouldn't squeak. If something made a loud noise, it was considered a violation of order. The owners could express their dissatisfaction with noise because they considered peace and quiet to be part of their rights. The bedrooms were always located in the quietest part of the house. There should not have been a single unnecessary sound there. The bedrooms had windows facing the courtyard, not the street. This reduced the likelihood of hearing loud shouts or the clatter of wheels. Inside the bedroom, heavy curtains and massive furniture muffled the sound. Everything was designed so that people could sleep peacefully. Nighttime peace was sacred. Silence became part of the culture. The streets in front of wealthy homes were sometimes covered with straw if someone in the house was ill. The straw absorbed the sound of hooves and wheels. It looked strange to passers-by, but it was considered a sign of care. Society valued the ability to respect another person's peace and quiet. Even neighbors were willing to silently accept such an innovation, all so that the sick person could sleep. Society truly valued peace and quiet and was willing to pay a lot of money for it. Silence became an important element of the concept of decency. It separated the upper classes from everyone else. People believed that a peaceful environment made a person refined. Therefore, architecture and behavior were subordinated to this ideal. It was silence as a social symbol. In poor neighborhoods, silence was an impossible dream. Houses there were built quickly and cheaply, without any thought for soundproofing. The walls were thin, and every sound penetrated inside unhindered. Noise reigned day and night, and no one could escape it. The poor got used to the constant hum, but it drained their strength. The walls of cheap houses were as thin as paper, letting in every sound from the street. The cries of merchants could be heard from early morning. The rumbling of carts on cobblestones filled the air. Drunken songs and swearing from pubs added to the chaos. Night brought no rest. The city continued to sound without stopping. Inside the crowded rooms, the noise became even louder. People slept close together, and every sound was amplified many times over. Snoring, coughing, crying children, everything mixed into one endless cacophony. Illness made these sounds even more painful and unpleasant. Sleep was a rare luxury, and even then, it was shallow. The quality of sleep suffered so much that people often woke up tired. They learned to tune out the noise, but their bodies could not fully rest. Fatigue accumulated for weeks. This affected both health and mood. Poor neighborhoods became places of chronic sleep deprivation, and this was invisible to wealthy society. The lack of soundproofing deprived people of even a hint of privacy. Every conversation between neighbors was heard by everyone around. Quarrels turned into a spectacle for the whole house. Secrets existed only in dreams. This created constant nervousness. People felt vulnerable. Factory horns and train whistles often pierced the night air. The city lived by the rules of the industrial age. Workers woke up to factory signals, and the nights were short. The vibrations from the trains passed through the thin walls. The dishes shook. The floor trembled. Peace and quiet were unattainable. For a rich man, sound was a choice. He could order music or demand silence. His house was a cocoon protecting him from the outside world. He could turn off the noise as easily as he could blow out a candle. For a poor man, however, sound was inevitable. It was violence that could not be resisted. The city did not give him a moment's peace. This auditory aggression depleted the nervous system no less than hunger or cold. People became irritable, quick-tempered, and nervous. Noise destroyed psychological stability. Silence became a symbol of power and control over life. That is why those who could afford it sought it so desperately, and those who needed it most were hopelessly unable to obtain it. Heating in the Victorian era was the main indicator of wealth. In rich houses, there were fireplaces in every room, including bedrooms, hallways, and even bathrooms. Coal burned around the clock, maintaining a comfortable temperature throughout the entire mansion. The fuel consumption was enormous, but no one counted the cost when it came to warmth. Fireplaces were not just a source of heat, but also the centerpiece of the interior, decorated with marble and carvings. Before going to bed, servants would add fresh wood and coal to ensure that the fire would not go out before morning. Special screens protected the room from sparks but allowed the life-giving heat to pass through. In poor homes, there was often only one fireplace for the entire apartment or floor, and it was rarely lit. Coal was expensive and was saved for cooking rather than heating. People collected wood chips, old furniture, and any rubbish that could burn from the streets. Often, the only source of heat in a poor person's room was a small brazier with smoldering coals. It gave off little heat, but a lot of carbon monoxide and soot. People sat close around it, stretching their hands toward the faint flame. The walls were covered with black soot, but no one was bothered by it. The lack of heating meant that in winter, the walls inside the houses were covered with frost. The water in the buckets froze overnight, turning into ice. Waking up in such a room was a physical ordeal. Breath turned into steam that hung in the air. The poor used their body heat as their only free resource. Sleeping huddled together, backs pressed against each other, was vital. Dogs and cats were also allowed into bed, not out of love for animals, but as living hot water bottles. The temperature difference between a rich and a poor house could be tens of degrees. Some lived in eternal summer, others in eternal winter. The cold penetrated the bones, causing chronic inflammation of the joints and lungs. It was an invisible killer that came every night. Rich homes had a complex system of dampers and chimneys to regulate the draft. The heat was controllable, obedient, and safe. For the poor, the fire was wild, dirty, and often caused fires. An overturned brazier could destroy an entire neighborhood of wooden slums. The struggle for warmth was a daily battle for survival. Every piece of coal found was a small victory. Heat was a currency valued above gold on cold London nights. What a person slept on determined the quality of their rest more than anything else. The rich slept on tall, multi-layered structures. The base was a mattress made of horsehair, resilient, durable, and hygienic. It held its shape well and provided support for the back. On top of it was the famous feather bed, a huge bag filled with selected goose down. The down had been collected over many years. It was light, airy, and incredibly warm. The body sank into it like a cloud, without feeling a single hard spot. The feather bed had to be fluffed every morning so that it would not clump together. The poor slept on what was called a straw mattress. It was a bag made of coarse burlap, stuffed with straw, hay, or even dry leaves. The straw quickly crumpled, turning into hard dust. Through the thin fabric, sharp stalks pricked the sides, preventing relaxation. Such mattresses were a breeding ground for insects. Fleas and bedbugs felt great in the straw. It was impossible to get rid of them, so people simply had to burn the old straw and fill the bag with new straw. It was an endless war with an invisible enemy. Sometimes rags or old cloth were used instead of straw. Such mattresses were bumpy, uneven, and absorbed moisture. Sleeping on them was like sleeping on a pile of garbage. They constantly emitted a musty, rotten smell. In the cheapest lodgings, there were no mattresses at all. People slept on bare wooden bunks or directly on the floor, using their coats as bedding. The hard surface pressed on their bones, disrupting blood circulation. In the morning, their bodies ached as if they had been beaten. It took the maid up to an hour a day to make the rich man's bed. The linen was boiled, starched, and ironed with heavy irons. It crunched with cleanliness and smelled of lavender, which was placed in the wardrobes. For the poor, a mattress could last for decades, being passed down or bought from a second-hand dealer. It held the history of the illnesses, births, and deaths of all its owners. It was an object that absorbed all the sorrow of a poor life. The softness of the bed was a symbol of pampering and status. The hardness of the poor man's bed shaped his character, rough, resilient, and unassuming. The Victorian era was obsessed with theories about health, and one of the most persistent was the fear of miasmas. People believed that diseases spread through harmful vapors rising from swamps, sewers, and the night air. This idea governed not only medicine but also everyday life. Many were convinced that the air after sunset was particularly dangerous. Even educated people trusted these theories because science did not yet know about bacteria. Thus, miasmas became part of culture and habits. It was believed that night air was poisonous, carried disease, and was harmful to sleeping people. People seriously believed that a draft could cause a cold, and a fresh breeze could lead to a deadly fever. This fear was reinforced by numerous epidemics, which were associated with the air. This belief made people avoid walking at night. Almost every household lived under the influence of these fears. They shaped how people felt about sleep and rest. This misconception influenced how people organized their sleep, and it affected both the rich and the poor equally. The rules of behavior were similar, although the level of comfort varied greatly. People were afraid of open windows and believed that the cool air could undermine their health. Even on warm summer nights, the windows remained closed. The night air was considered a threat, not part of the natural environment, and almost no one questioned the correctness of this practice. In wealthy homes, bedroom windows were tightly closed at nightfall. Servants checked the frames to ensure there were no gaps. Thick curtains were drawn, turning the room into a dense, quiet pocket of air. The owners were proud that they could completely isolate themselves from the street. This approach was considered delicate and civilized. People believed that closed windows were a guarantee of health. Heavy curtains not only blocked out the light, but also served as a shield against miasmas. They hung from the ceiling to the floor, protecting the sleeper from any air currents. Combined with massive window frames, they formed a barrier between the house and the outside world. Sometimes curtains were made of thick wool to create a feeling of comfort. All this was done not for beauty, but for safety. And the richer the house, the thicker the fabrics. Bedrooms turned into airtight boxes where the air was not renewed throughout the night. People fell asleep in one atmosphere, and woke up in a completely different one, heavy and musty. Sometimes the rooms were filled with the smell of the fireplace, perfume, or burning candles. But no one was bothered by this because fresh air was considered much more dangerous. Such isolation was the norm and a sign of concern for health. Parents taught their children these rules. Combined with a burning fireplace and several people in the room, this led to severe oxygen deprivation. The fire burned oxygen, and the thick walls prevented the air from being renewed. By morning, people woke up with headaches and dry mouths. They attributed their discomfort to anything but the real cause, the lack of fresh air. The irony was that the luxurious bedroom was created for health reasons, but it was harmful. The rich became prisoners of their own fears. By morning, the air became heavy, and many felt sleepy and exhausted. But this was perceived as a normal reaction of the body. No one associated their morning malaise with closed windows. They continued to blame the miasmas that supposedly remained behind the walls. The worse they felt, the more people reinforced their habits. This created a vicious circle. The poor were also afraid of drafts and night air, but for a different reason: the cold. In their homes, any movement of air meant a direct threat of hypothermia. Cracks in the walls were plugged with paper, rags, and scraps of clothing. A dilapidated house could be blown through even on a quiet night. Therefore, they were forced to close the windows not because of miasmas, but for survival. The fear was real, not ideological. They plugged the cracks as carefully as they could, but this created new difficulties. Heat quickly accumulated in the crowded rooms, followed by dampness. People's faces glistened with moisture, and the artificial climate became suffocating. Dozens of sleeping bodies gave off heat and carbon dioxide. By morning, the rooms had turned into heavy, airless chambers. Many woke up exhausted, even if they had slept for a long time. The lack of ventilation contributed to the rapid spread of infections. Diseases were transmitted from one person to another in a matter of days. Tuberculosis spread particularly rapidly. The damp air and crowded living conditions were ideal for its growth. Entire families fell ill. Doctors at the time paid little attention to this. If one person fell ill, everyone fell ill. This was the cruel reality of poor neighborhoods. The damp, stagnant air became a deadly trap. But most people did not associate illness with a lack of ventilation. They continued to fear cold drafts. Tragedies repeated themselves year after year. This was the price of living in overcrowded areas. Doctors of the time, following the fashion, often advised patients to avoid the cool night air. They claimed that cold air carried disease in tiny particles of dirt. The fresh breeze from the Thames was considered a carrier of cholera. Patients trusted such recommendations because they sounded authoritative. It was only towards the end of the era that science began to prove the benefits of ventilation. The process was slow and controversial. Wealthy homes had a system of ventilation grills, but they were often closed for fear of drafts. The owners were afraid that the air from the street would bring disease. The servants strictly ensured that the grills remained closed at night. In this way, the wealthy deprived themselves of fresh air. They preferred to breathe in the scents of candles, smoke, or perfume. It was part of their cultural habits. Even canopy beds served as protection from the air. Heavy fabrics created an additional barrier around the sleeping person. It was as if the person was hiding in their own little refuge. This enhanced the feeling of security. The canopy seemed like a shield against disease, and people enjoyed hiding under it. The fabric created an additional barrier and helped maintain the illusion of control over health. Canopies decorated the home, but their function was deeper. They added warmth to the room and protected against the slightest movements of air. The sleeper felt isolated, even though they were actually breathing the same stale air. This tradition continued for decades. It was considered part of normal life. In this regard, the rich and the poor were surprisingly similar. Both slept in stuffy conditions, albeit for different reasons. Some closed themselves off from miasmas, others from the cold. As a result, both classes breathed heavy air saturated with carbon dioxide. This was harmful to everyone's health. Misconceptions made no distinction between classes. We saw two worlds that existed in parallel but never intersected. Sleep, that basic physiological need, became a mirror of social inequality in the Victorian era. For some, it was an art, a pleasure, and a fortress of velvet and warmth. For others, it was a short, painful pause in the struggle for survival, full of cold and harshness. The gap between golden bedrooms and icy basements was not just a question of money. It was a question of human dignity and the right to basic comfort. The history of sleep is a story of how society values its citizens, and a rope for a penny speaks more eloquently than any words. What elements of modern life do you think would have shocked people of that era? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to learn more about in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into history.